Hello, class. Apologize for this being a little bit late. I'm still getting over a cold, and I think I'll probably be able to get through this. Um, I have a number of notes about this past week, week two, in which you compared, excuse me, monitoring models for independent CRAs, CROs, and sponsor. And I wanted to provide some some information as it relates to my personal experience as I've worked with all three models, or even been a part of the uh, work for a sponsor as one of these models, actually as all three. And then we'll talk a little bit about week three. So, independent CRAs, and every situation is going to be different. It situation will vary depending on the size of the sponsor, the size of the study, how many countries are involved. Is it obviously if it's a single country or is it international? So no one answer. Always going with independence, always using a CRO is always going to be the right answer. Although there's plenty of times when upper management just there may be a contract. There's always all kinds of circumstances, even as the senior PM, that you may not be aware of, and even I've gotten it where I just have a VP that just comes up to me and just says, "I don't care what you're thinking. This is what you're going to do. Period." Okay, so let's start with the independent CRAs. Again, advantages and disadvantages. They're going to be regionally located. So if you have a study, say in the Northeast, then it's much easier to select an ICRA that is actually live in that area. That reduces your cost and travel costs, that is. And you can gather the information. It's much easier to make travel plans, that sort of thing. And so things will tend to go a little bit faster. Therapeutic areas with an independent CRA, there's going to be there's some of your more difficult ones, say oncology, or maybe even some levels of pediatrics, or all kinds of subgroups. It's always excuse me. It's easier to find independents that have the experience that many sponsors would require, as opposed to going to a CRO where that's going to be a little bit more difficult to identify. With an independent, you pay for work done. So whenever they're on the clock, that can cut both ways though. The independents may have a higher hourly rate, and you have to identify them as a separate vendor. So you're going to be sending checks to this individual, to their company, as opposed to a single check going to a CRO. But with the CRO, you're not only paying for the CRA, whatever their rate is, or whatever the CRO determines their rate is, but you have to pay for all of the CRO's expenses, and of course that includes all of the benefits that are provided to the CRAs, physical plant, and all of the infrastructure. If they quit, if you have an independent that quits, the sponsor is going to be responsible most of the time for having to replace them. And I say most of the time because here comes an additional complication. There are lots of agencies out there that can act as an intermediary, middleman, who can identify an independent CRA for you. They can do as little or as much as you want them to. It's not a CRO, but it's simply an agency, because all they'll do many times is they simply identify the find that you give them as a sponsor. You give them your requirements, and they will go out, and they usually have people that they've been in contact, they've worked with for a number of years. They're recruiters who will be able to go out and find an independent who will meet the criteria that has been set forth. So they have to live in a particular place. They have to have particular therapeutic area experience of X number of years, and they can go through through the CVs that they have in their system and be able to find somebody for you. That they can also, and that can also that same agency can also have somebody who is going to manage those independents, and if they quit, the agency will likely be responsible for identifying a new one. So you also, in that, as you may or may not have surmised at this point, you have much more power as the sponsor to select an independent CRA, because they're going to be usually they're far fewer. If you have a very large study and say that you need, I don't know, 20 CRAs or 50 CRAs, the likelihood is not going to be high that you're going to go with the independent model. You'll probably end up going with the CRO model, but we can address that in a few minutes. If you need, let's say, a half a dozen or so, you can you'll be able to interview them individually, look at their CVs, and you have there's a much more and a much closer selection process than with, say, a CRO. They tend to cost less because you're not paying, even with the agency. Like I said, if you use an agency, obviously you have to. They're going to need to have a bit of their overhead, but it's going to be far less than using the CRO. And if you go directly with the CRO, then you don't even have the agency cost. Now, moving on to the CRO, they tend to be more expensive for the reasons that I already cited, but it also is a fixed. It will also be a fixed rate. If you're going to in the contract, you'll have identified, say, the number of hours and the percentage of time that the CRAs are going to be working, and so no matter if they work that many hours, then that's the amount that you're going to be paying for them. If they work less, well, your amount is still fixed. Now, this is where the rub comes in. If they end up having to work more hours, say that you have them for an allocation of 50%, and they are you either ask for a greater allocation, or I guess the managers come back and say, listen, the amount of work that has been described in the contract, it's not possible to do this with a 50% allocation for the following reasons. Then you have what's described as an out of scope, or a cost over. It's just described as an out of scope because the contract has to be amended to address the issue that's not presented, and you're going to pay more. An out of scope for less, I guess it's possible. I've never had one, but theoretically it is possible. Excuse me. There are a few other things that can happen when you're using CRAs from a CRO. Typically, the turnover rate with CRAs tends to be higher. And if your contract and you're under the expectation that you're going to be working with CRA 3s, so those are the CRAs that have been assigned to your study, generally speaking, it is you're not going to get CRA 3s replacing those 3s. Typically, you'll end up with 1s or 2s. At least that's been my experience. When the contract is initially written, you're expecting 3s. Now you're ending up with 2s and 1s, so that's going to be if you catch it, and again, depending on how closely you're looking at the replacements, how high the turnover rate, again, a lot of variables here. It's something that you want to keep an eye on and say, listen, I was expecting 3. I am paying for 3s. Now you're signing me up with 1s. The contract needs to be amended. And in that case, the contract would come down if you find it acceptable that you are replacing 3s with 1s or even 2s. If they quit, then the CRO is responsible for replacing them. Again, something else, they tend to have fewer years of experience than the independents. Quality issues, you tend to have a higher percentage or a higher number of issues that develop because of the fewer years of experience, but the CRO will usually do all they can to fix the fix whatever problems present themselves as a result of their employees, for their inexperience or whatever the case may be. Let's see. Travel. Travel costs tend to be higher. I think I don't remember off the top of my head who, there was somebody, I think it was actually the sponsor CRAs had a significantly higher travel costs. I'm not quite sure why that would be in real life. In a real life situation, the requirements for travel tend to be pretty much the same. You need at least a 7-day notice to be able to go anywhere, and you are only allowed to travel business class if it's over X number of hours. Sometimes it's only if it's international. There's a number of things that, having worked in all three areas, I'm not quite sure why. I think it was just something to add a deliberate complication for your evaluation, which is completely legitimate. But the travel costs tend to be higher because they're not usually regionally located. And again, if there's high turnover, then that regionality tends to disappear. And so your costs tend to be higher than the independents tend to be. You have little choice in the CRAs that you're going to be picking. There's usually not, unless it's a very small study that you're working with a CRO for, you're not usually going to have interview. I know the last big study I did, last study I did with with the CRO, I didn't get a chance to see any of the CROs. Now, I was able to review their CVs, but in the same way that you're usually not hired for a position simply based on your CV, you tend to be interviewed, but it's not something that often happens. There's very little contact between direct contact between sponsors and CRAs. The only time I ever spoke or met with any of the CRAs is if I happened to be traveling to their region, in which case I was also with my counterparts. Excuse me, my counterparts from the CRO. So it was I could never find myself in a position of calling, say, a CRA at the CRO, whereas with the independents, the relationship tends to be much closer, and there's frequent, whereas much more direct contact between the sponsor and the independents. There is something, I guess, the last thing for the CRAs. Depending on the culture at the CRO, it is certainly not heard of, and I've personally seen it, where CRAs who are not quite as busy as they could be with their level of allocation to the study might be diverted to work on something else for short periods of time. Usually not something that they're going to be dedicated to, certainly, but they may get pulled off and say, listen, you're not doing anything right now. Can you help us with this for the next week or so? And so that's something else that I've seen happen. It's not, as with an independent CRA, it's very easy to see almost everywhere that they are at any given time. Everything is time-stamped. With the CRAs, it's less so. Now, the CRO also is going to be one of the big positives for CROs is if you need CRAs, but you're going to need other services. That's definitely something that you are going to be needing to go to a CRO. So let's say if you don't have a CTMS, but you need one, the CRO is very likely, of any significant size, going to be able to provide you with one. That is a clinical trial management system that brings together lots and lots, if not all, the information as it relates to the study, and be able to present it to the project manager in dashboard formats, and so all the stuff that the CRAs are able to do goes into the system. Makes it very. The theory is, and just like with everything else, there are good systems, and then there are systems that are not as good. But many CTMSs are just, they're absolutely invaluable, and without one, it's just you're not as efficient. The team is not as efficient as they could be. Independent CRAs are not going to be providing you with a CTMS or anything else for that matter, an IVRS or any other programming systems that may be necessary. And with a CRO, you can get that as all part of a package. Now, with the sponsor, pendulum tends to swing back and forth every 10 years. Right now, where it seems to be is that many companies have a small core group of CRA monitoring group as something that they keep. I guess depending on the company, I don't keep track of all the major companies. I just know a couple that I've worked with and still have coworkers and friends at some of these companies. I just happen to know, but they may have a small group. There wasn't. I guess it was maybe six years ago or so, 5 years ago, where the pendulum really began to swing within the industry of moving from internal monitoring groups to outsourcing everything. And it used to be every 10 years it would swing just about full all the way. So everything was being outsourced to everything is insourced. And somebody will come up, some senior VP somewhere up in the system will come up with a way of being able to justify the savings of going one way or the other. Right now, it's not quite there. Like I said, I know companies that have some internal resource, but you have greater control over exactly what they're doing. You're able to very quickly shift people around from one study to another. But they can be very expensive because you have to pay for all of their benefits. And some of these companies, the benefits are very generous, and so that costs a significant amount of money. Now, what I've seen is that they use these individuals now, or these groups, to oversee some of the monitoring that is done by, say, CRO groups, and so they sort of report. That's part of the reporting structure. They help out in some ways with various tasks that, again, that where there are gaps with the monitoring, or they may act as, say, a group in the U.S. So let's say that you've got CRAs or the CRA, the monitoring group within the U.S. They may act as the monitors just for the U.S. and you use a group of CRAs for the rest of the world. Again, there's all kinds of combinations of things that that may occur depending on the experience of the sponsor and what they feel is best for them. Let's see. So, week 3, you're working on continuing on with the budget. Budgets are a very, very large part of what project managers do. So it's going to be a large part of what you do for this, for what we do here in this program and in this class. So week 3, you're going to be developing a study budget. There'll be an attached budget for comparison, and then you are to add at least 5 more line items to the budget. Try to think it through. Look at the article. Really read the articles about where those costs usually are. For those of you that are currently doing project management or been project managers, you can probably add 20 lines. 5 is plenty, but if you want, if there's some other attachments or subcategories that you want to add to the major 5, that's fine. And then they answer the 2 questions. Why is it important to accurately forecast a budget? So the thing that I want you to think about is, let's say you're running an independent company. You could be an independent CRA. And so you have a company within your name. Within that, you're going to be estimating how much money you are going to be making, and based on that, you are reporting to the IRS, in this case, just a larger group, how much and how much you should be paying in taxes quarterly. And if you think even bigger than that, you're reporting to the stockholders of how much money you think you're going to be making. And think in terms of, it's not only your own budget, but if you, and let's say that your studies could range, I don't know, from a few $1 million to $150 million. $150 million. Wow. Excuse me. Uh, so if you think in terms of, let's say you have a dozen of those, or in large companies, you may have dozens of studies of that size, and let's say that you are 10, each one of those is 10, 15% off, what's going to be the result? And that goes into the next question. What are the ramifications for being too high or too low? And is one of them better or worse than the other, or are they just a different set of problems? So think those through. Compare it to what would happen in your own house if you think that you're going to be making, let's say that just round numbers. Let's say that in your house you're making $100,000. If what are the ramifications? Again, thinking in terms of if you report to somebody that says you're going to be making $100,000, but you actually end up with $115,000, and you're supposed to be paying, say, taxes on 100, now you have 115, versus let's say it's 85. And so think in those terms. Start thinking about the assignment, the paper, because oftentimes that's going to be that sort of catches people by surprise, especially, and just this last thing, especially the enrollment graph. One thing that I just want to throw out there, the enrollment graph is something that has been a problem in putting together for students in the past. And I just want you to think in terms of looking at that graph and making sure that it makes sense. Can you actually look at the graph and be able to surmise information? Are you able to actually derive? Are you actually able to draw some conclusions? That's where I wanted to go. Draw some conclusions from that graph based on the numbers that are there. So the x-axis and y-axis actually have to have some sort of configuration to them. They have to have meaning, not just an open square with a couple of squiggly lines, and you say that this is enrollment and this is money and this is how my enrollment is going to be improved. And look, it went up. Okay, but be sure that your graph actually you can actually see that and see how much that sort of stuff. So be sure that it makes sense. Spend some time on it and recognize that it's not as easy as it may seem at first blush. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to reach out to me. If you have pressing, you can send the email and then text me and tell me that the email is there, so I'm not looking at it 5 hours later when you're sitting waiting for an answer. So good luck, and we'll see you on the discussion board.